So we've been talking about the first Islamic conquests. Now what we are going to do is dive into a deeper example about the supposed impacts and ideas that historians have had about how the coming of Islam marks a sort of civilizational or transformational difference in cities, in the nature of cities themselves. So this is a question that was raised by an art historian named Jean Sauvaget, who was writing in the first half of the 20th century. He and many other scholars at that time understood the coming of Islam as marking the end of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire, of course, started in the Italian peninsula, lived in and expanded across the Mediterranean. But at this point, its kind of core provinces were not only Constantinople, where it was had now its capital, that is today is Istanbul, but also major cities and places like Alexandria in Egypt, and Damascus and parts of Palestine. And for scholars like Sauvaget and others, one of the reasons why the Romans fell is because the rise of Islam, right? As this area was cut off, this traditional heartland or major area of what remained of the Roman Empire was now lost to so-called civilization. But he didn't just argue that it was a kind of a break. In that sense, it actually argued that there was a different form of culture, that a different vision of what the city could be emerged there. Now, he believed that the civilizational change was the idea of moving from the polis meaning city in the Roman sense or Greek sense, to the Medina meaning city in Arabic. What he meant by that is that he went from sort of orderly Roman cities, which we can see kind of depicted here in this illustration, where you have again a forum or a fora in the middle, a temple, and then from that, major arteries going north and south, east and west to the city walls in a grid-like pattern, right? So we have straight colonnaded streets, open fora and squares, and then within that different public institutions, the temples, the theaters, the baths that are seen. And we can see this, for example, in the format of Caesarea, which was the city we talked about just before, that was destroyed possibly in the Sasanian, possibly in the Islamic conquests. But what we have here is a very nice, clear grid pattern. Now you might be wondering, well, isn't that just the most logical way to set up a city? Well, yes and no. The reason why North American cities are set up along a grid pattern is not because it's particularly logical. It's because we actually, early settlers adopted and reinstituted the Roman plan ideas of planning a city onto their new settlements, and therefore many North American cities have a grid pattern to them. So that's the kind of imagined Roman city. And so in contrast to that, he imagined that with the coming of Islam, that the city had actually changed. Now this is going to be all wrong, but I'm just going to present it to you. So he says that, in place of the straight and orderly city of the Romans, now you have winding streets. You have the Medina, right? The kind of warrens of alleyways, etc., which you see depicted in scenes from Aladdin to the 1001 Nights, something like that. Instead of having public squares, public spaces, you have everything becomes private. The city kind of is closed to its inhabitants. Things only happen behind walls or behind doors, and the only public spaces are no longer the theaters or the baths or the public temples, but just the mosques. So for him, this was a transformative change in the nature of the city itself and what people thought of themselves as city dwellers. Now, it turns out that all of the things that he was talking about, all of these things that he thought was a transformation that was brought about by a new civilization from Arabia or so forth, actually wasn't the case. That was already happening centuries before, under the late antique Roman and under the late Roman Empire, right? And what was started off, the reason why you get winding streets and indirect things is that shops and houses started encroaching on street. So just like during the pandemic, restaurants started putting tables outside and taking over parking spaces, extending their what do you call it? Their shadow over the little real estate around their shop. The same thing happened in late Roman streets. Shops, houses started extending themselves first with, balconies and verandas and other things, and then slowly making those permanent extensions. The streets became crooked and indirect. Sometimes it got cut off, sometimes, and you get kind of broken alleyways. Everything becomes a winding passageway. At the same time, we have the abandonment of carts, the abandonment of wheels, and instead pack animals are mainly used to move through the city for a variety of reasons. Already at that time, actually, bathhouses and theaters were going into decline. There was no real theater world by this period. The Hippodrome was a major center for late Roman life, but even by then, by the 5th and 6th century, we don't see that as much anymore, and churches become the main public buildings. Similarly, hammams or bathhouses are no longer these gigantic complexes, but often smaller sites just for the neighborhood or for a family. And similarly, theaters also go away. They're now become sites of pottery kilns. So we actually see all these things that Sauvaget had attributed to Muslims, to Islam, as some sort of civilizational break was already a process that had been occurring in the late antique Mediterranean beforehand and had nothing to do with Islam, right? So we have to be careful when we try to see the coming of Islam or these conquests as some sort of deep civilizational break, because there's actually relatively little evidence for it. One of the interesting things is that if we actually look at the cities that the new conquerors built, as I pointed out before, they tended to create garrison towns, not in Syria, but in many other parts of the Middle East, in Kufa and Basra, so southern Iraq, and Fustat, which is in Cairo, basically Kairouan, which is in Tunisia, Istahr Marv in Iran. They created these garrison towns called Amsar to keep the soldiers separated from the population and to keep their piety, let's say, concentrated. Now, these are planned and coordinated settlements, and they're meant to separate the people from the local population. What's interesting is that if you look at the actual layout of these places, they actually follow a sort of grid pattern, or at least a very logical, clearly demarcated space. They house soldiers, they house their families, and their clients. Remember, clients is a word that we use to speak about people, sometimes slaves, sometimes non-slaves, who became attached to nomads and were under their protection. So what we have is the early Muslims now took clients from the local population and sometimes brought them in and helped house them in these amsar. And as the conquests continue and they spread further and further, there's amsar, garrison towns, put out further and further. So if you look on the map and find where Marv is, you'll see it's actually quite far today. I think it's in Turkmenistan. And each city was replenished by different flows of migration. So the conquest took a few generations, and there was different flows of people coming out of Arabia, moving to these garrison towns, readapting to there, and then going even further out into basically Eastern Iran or North Africa. So keeping this in mind, again, the question is always, what does archaeology show, and what are our assumptions about the nature of conquest?